recording. I think we should be rolling now. So again, Nick Norwitz, thanks for coming on.
For sure. Thanks for having me. Good. Enjoying a Sunday before school starts up again, which is something you're familiar with, just offline, I guess. We were just talking about how cool it is to be talking kind of at the same level, or at least in the same phase of life,
right.
Both doing medical school. So this will be a special podcast for me.
That's awesome. Yeah, thanks a lot for agreeing to have the conversation with me, because I'm looking for guests, who are sort of more experienced in areas that I'm actually interested in, and who can, I think, bring some value to me, not only to me but also to other people. I think that'd be a good conversation. So just to start off that whole episode, I'm always at the beginning asking 3 questions just to get things started. It's like, what's your full name, what's your favorite exercise, and what's your favorite piece of meal or piece of food that you like to enjoy?
Ooh, all right, I like it. Well, my full name is Nicholas Giacomo Norwitz. I don't know why I'm throwing my middle name in there, but it's Jake, Italian for Jake, which actually relates to my favorite food, a lot of Mediterranean style food. We'll get into that. The second question was my favorite exercise. Right. I used to be a distance runner. I love to run. Nothing gives me a high like running. So when I was in high school and then early on in college, marathons, half marathons. Right now, I can't do that because of some knee problems. Trying to get back into it recently, but mostly focusing on just like calisthenics, body weight, some lifting. Lower body favorite exercise, jumping alternating lunges, because you can do them anywhere and they just fire up your lower body. I don't know anybody that can do it solidly for 90 seconds and not be shot. And then upper body, just basic chin-ups, push-up variations. Awesome. Get a lot of mileage out of those. So, and then favorite food. It's funny, I'm always changing my diet. I'm somebody who always likes to tweak and play with things, but consistently I'm a giant olive oil snob. I think most of my calories comes from olive oil. In fact, I just put up a tweet about me just drowning salmon in some beef and olive oil. But I actually have no food aversions. I have a lot of intolerances, but I'll basically eat anything. I love experimenting with food. So if it's like a little baby octopus stuffed with egg yolks, we're having that in Japan at the Nishiki market, or duck's tongue, frog ovaries, had that in China. I really do love to experiment, and so yeah, I'll give anything a try. Anything odd, weird, that's kind of up my alley.
Yeah, that sounds funny. I mean, I would do the same thing probably. Anything that looks maybe weird or nobody else would like. I'm a big fan of organ meats, and I'm eating every part of the I'm eating brain and stuff, and spleen and pancreas, and I've got a butcher where I can order everything, and it's funny how people always look at me when I'm telling them that I'm eating brain.
Well, first of all, where do you get brain? Because I cannot get it here.
Well, I'm ordering at the butcher.
Spleen, because it's the one organ I've never been able to make tasty.
Oh, okay. Your first question about brain, I'm just asking. I went to the butcher and I asked, okay, what parts of animal can I get? And he's basically you can get everything, because they're slaughtering an animal, and they're all the parts of the animal. And I mean, okay, can I get brain? You're sure, let's try it out. And I'm ordering brain, and I eat it, and it's fine. So I mean, maybe you just need to ask. I don't know.
I've asked. No,
okay,
I can't get brain here, and not in Boston. I actually could in the UK. So I did I haven't done my background, but I did my PhD at Oxford, and there, when you went to the covered market, you could actually get kind of whatever. It's so economical too. Not only are you not wasting anything, but it's so cheap because nobody else is buying it.
It's really cheap. It's ridiculous. It's so ridiculous. I bought a half a pound. It wasn't half a pound. It was roughly a pound of brain and a pound of spleen, and together it was if I'm needed to think, it's it would equate to $6 or $7. I don't know if that's much or not, but
no.
It was really cheap. Also considering the fact that all the other pieces of meat in that butcher where I was ordering the organ meats, they were super expensive, and I was getting the organ meats for nothing, because nobody's buying them. It's super funny.
I quite enjoy them. Oh, my second question was, though, how do you cook spleen? Spleen is hard to make tasty. Like
I don't find it particularly distasteful when I just cook it. Like I just cook it for like maybe 30 minutes and that's it. And then I eat it and maybe I sold it. But that's basically what I do with the spleen. And I found it fine. And I gave it to my parents and they're not big fans of like organ meats and stuff. They like eat it because I tell them that it's healthy and that they should eat it, but they do not really like it particularly. But they still found that the spleen was reasonable.
Yeah.
So I just cook it. I don't know what you usually do with the spleen.
I have no aversions. I've just never like every other organ meat. I find a way to make it interesting, creative, like really tasty. So like liver, you can make like a liver bacon, like roasted garlic pate, or just
right.
Seared liver's pretty good. Spleen, I've just never been able. I'll eat it, but I can't get excited about it. I can get excited about most of the things, so I'll have to play.
I see. Like I'm usually satisfied with the simplest version of cooking the particular food. So if I don't, I understand. I see the point of making it fancy and getting excited for like trying out different things. But I'm being like, okay, if I can just cook it and eat it, then I'm good with that.
Yeah, it's actually funny. I prefer in general to eat simple things myself. Like I could eat eggs, salmon, and olive oil for every meal for the rest of my life. Fine. But I love to cook. I actually love the exercise.
Yeah.
One of the things I did in Oxford was write a cookbook like on the side. So when I'm cooking for other people, I love to get extravagant, and then I'll make myself some like salmon and eggs. But
right. But I think
it
depends on
make spleen to great.
I think it depends on how much time you can find, right? Probably if you're like busy and it's probably more often than not you will not find. I don't know how it is in your case, but more often than not, I cannot find enough time to really sit down and think of what I'm gonna cook and like do all these fancy stuff. It's just easier and quicker to just take and eat things as they are.
No, for daily life myself, like I got 20 minutes between two classes to grab something. But like it's my hobby. It's something that like on a vacation I'll be like, all right, I'm gonna make like something creative and spend a few hours doing it. It's meditative. But I'm sure people don't want to hear me talk about my cooking hobby. We can get into the meat of it.
Yeah, let's talk about tell us who you are. Tell us what you do. Tell us what you're studying or what you have studied, basically, just so people understand who I'm talking to.
Sure. So my name is Nick. I grew up in Newton, Massachusetts, and did my undergrad at Dartmouth. I did my undergrad, my BA in cell bio and biochem, and then after graduating, I went to Oxford. I did my PhD in ketogenics and neurometabolism, particularly Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease in the lab of Professor Kieran Clark. That was a lot of fun. But while I was there, I ended up getting quite sick with various metabolic conditions. I won't give the whole woe is me story here. I've done that too many times. But I had a problem with my bones, some problems with my gut. Ended up getting quite ill, ending up in and out of the hospital, even in a palliative care ward at one point in time. And, I got kind of desperate, and I think like a lot of people just started experimenting, not with any expectation, but just out of desperation. And ended up finding that after all the medications I had tried, all the commonly perceived of as healthy diets I've tried, didn't really work for me. I kind of had a last shot with a ketogenic diet, and it worked like day and night. It was like a light bulb went on. My gut symptoms, they really went away. The inflammation went away. I had a very strong reaction, and it just made me feel like alive again. And so that was my introduction to the area of metabolic health and low carbohydrate diets. And at the time that it happened, I honestly thought I was just a one-off. I had been a medical zebra, a term used in medicine to kind of describe like medical oddities, let's say, in terms of my diagnoses. And so I figured I was one in terms of my response to a low carbohydrate diet. But just because I had that experience, I started getting really interested in metabolic medicine, generally metabolism, and started delving into these spaces, the spaces that you're now exploring. Listening to conference lectures, kind of getting in with low carb communities on Facebook and other forms of social media, and hearing these stories that really just resonated with me. And I came to this realization that my story arc was actually very common, where somebody struggles with a metabolic condition kind of gets desperate, experiments with various forms of metabolic medicine, let's call it, including low carbohydrate diets, and has results that they genuinely couldn't have imagined. Like they have a life back and a quality of life back that they could have never conceived of. And it makes them very interested and excited. And I've seen that across the spectrum for different diseases, neurological diseases, obesity, diabetes, gastrointestinal diseases, autoimmune diseases. And it's just gotten me really interested in thinking about how we, as a society, approach and address the chronic diseases that are the scourge of our time. You know, our medical system right now is built to deal with infectious diseases.
Oh, absolutely.
Most people would agree with that. And the, profile of illness has just entirely changed, and our system isn't equipped for that. The drugs that we have, I mean, they're great. Don't get me wrong. I'm not anti-drug at all, but they shouldn't be first line. That shouldn't be the mentality, and it's become the mentality just because of changes in, societal norms and, our environmental construction. It's really obviously a very deep topic that we can maybe get into a little bit, but I just find it really interesting, and it kind of became my calling, so to speak, moving into medical school. So finishing my PhD, I'm now a med student at Harvard Med, and kind of being part of the next generation like you. I think we share a passion for exciting our peers and getting the next generation fired up about like metabolic health as the foundation for everything we have to do. Make that the base of the pyramid, and then let's innovate with pharmacologics X, Y, and Z. But you really can't do much until the metabolism and the behavior is in order. So that's where I am right now, and just excited to be moving forward.
Yeah, it sounds super interesting, and just to we don't have to go super deep in your like exact details of your the health issues that you were going through, but just to what was the diagnosis? Ulcerative colitis, right?
The gastrointestinal diagnosis was ulcerative colitis.
Right. And so I was talking to Raphael Sotoli back in the day, and he was telling me that he was having similar symptoms, not of the not of the same magnitude of probably the symptoms that you were having. So they were more mild in the case for Raphael. But he like found out that plants were basically triggering his symptoms, and he's more on a carnivore-ish sort of diet and eating mostly animal foods, and that's what he found to be of the most value for him. And so like I'm wondering if there is like if there is like a known sort of cause, or if we really know what causes ulcerative colitis, because it seems like you found lots of success in trying out a ketogenic diet to fix your issues, and it seems not to matter really how much plants versus animal foods you eat, because it doesn't seem to trigger your symptoms back in some sense. So what would you say?
Yeah, I would say that I think that there are multiple prongs by which carbohydrate restriction could improve inflammatory bowel diseases, Crohn's and colitis. And I'm aware of Rafi's case. I know a lot of people actually now that have had improvements in Crohn's, colitis, and various forms of IBS by adopting some form of clean carbohydrate restriction. Often that is carnivory. That's become very popular. And, some people swear by it, and I won't negate that patient narrative. I was carnivore for 5 months. It's something I wanted to play with. And, I found it quite beneficial. What I find for me, though, is that my ketone levels actually correlate best with my symptomology, quite interestingly. When I started a ketogenic diet, the first form it took was a kind of very high unsaturated fat, mostly monounsaturated fat ketogenic diet. So tons of olive oil, olives, avocado, leafy green vegetables, fish, and around 35 to 40 grams of fiber per day. And that was sufficient to make the inflammation go away and the bleeding go away. I still did have some residual problems. I have the type of colitis I have, it kind of swings like a pendulum. So when you're having a flare, sorry to get graphic for people, but ulcerative colitis manifests in bloody diarrhea.
Right.
When you're in remission, what ends up happening is you have an IBS-C type profile with constipation, which is also quite problematic. So in terms of managing that other side of the pendulum, I've actually found reducing fiber to be helpful. I haven't eliminated it. Rather than having like 40 grams per day, I now have like 15 to 20.
Yeah.
But I do find that helps for me. And I did quite honestly find that when I was zero fiber, that my symptoms were pretty good. I found that reintroducing fiber hasn't created a lot of issues. I'm very particular about, what plant foods I reintroduce. And I know people probably want some sort of formula for what that would look like. Quite honestly, it's empiric. Everybody's different.
Yeah.
So for me, it was like carnivore was great as what one call a microbiome reset. And then I've been kind of slowly titrating various things back in. Some, cause issues, some don't. I found raw nuts cause issues. I think rhubarb is, for some reason, fantastic for me. I eat a ton of rhubarb, fennel, and the rules always change. I can actually now have garlic, which for a lot of people with gut issues is a big no-no. And that opens up a lot of doors. Quite honestly, my motivation for reintroducing plants is social. If I'm being transparent about it, I think that's
maybe also taste, because they add lots of, like, you can play around with plant foods, and they make the foods just more the meals just more interesting. I suppose
they do. I mean, I just like the social flexibility of it. I mean, I'm still on a pretty restricted diet overall, but that's my main motivation, and I think it's one that a lot of people face, and it's a valid one. Now, if it were that I needed to be carnivore to control my symptoms, and adding in any plants was a problem, like it is for some people, or at least some people report it, and I don't deny it, then of course I would prefer to eat just fish and ribeye and eggs for the rest of my life than have to deal with these symptoms. And I think that's sometimes what people don't get, that people going on these quote restrictive diets aren't doing this just willy-nilly.
Exactly.
They're doing it because they actually have medical need. And while the RCT data might not be there, and may never be there, I think that the narratives we hear in this space are extremely powerful, and becoming more and more validated. I actually did a podcast with Chris Palmer. He's a psychiatrist at Harvard, and he uses carnivore diets and ketogenic diets for some of his psychiatric patients with alarming efficacy. We actually ended up writing a paper on the topic, ketogenic diets for mental illnesses. And, when you look and delve down into the metabolism of it, it makes a lot of sense.
It does, absolutely. And we see like these remarkable stories of like Michaela Peterson, like having insane, success with adopting an all meat diet, and putting like her mental and psychological issues into, remission, as she's telling the story. So there is like so many, and maybe there's not like maybe we don't have the clinical data, as you say, yet, but there's like so much anecdotal evidence that we can point towards, and maybe there's more RCTs and clinical data to come out in the following years so that we can point to something.
Yeah, I mean, it's the way that the research infrastructure is built right now. It's really hard to do these studies. They cost millions of dollars. They're really hard to recruit for, and it's really difficult to do long term. And you used a term that I think will piss a lot of people off, which was anecdotal evidence, because most people would argue that anecdotes aren't evidence. I probably side with you in that, at minimum, the magnitude in terms of each individual case, but the magnitude in terms of numbers of the stories people are coming forward with are enough that people should at least be interested. But unfortunately, in social media, it becomes politicized, and it's you're right, you're wrong, not like, okay, this is interesting, let's just start there. There was a lot of controversy over that the first carnivore paper just came out.
Yes.
Yeah, with actually out of HMS. Ludwig was the senior author, and people were criticizing it. It's like, oh, it's self-reporting data. This is nonsense. And I'm like, well, 95% of patients are saying it works for them. Doesn't that matter? It's self-reported, but the patients are saying it works for them. So, like, shouldn't we listen to the patients? This is 2,000 patients screaming, "This is working. Please study this."
It should at least make us wonder. As you said, it should make us interested in, in further studying these people or studying these diets. And it should at least raise some questions on the validity in these criticisms that people that people pose on meat and animal products, because we have that narrative which is pretty mainstream, which got pretty mainstream, that animal products are bad basically and meat is bad. And so if we see more and more sort of anecdotal evidence of people eating almost only meat and getting so much better, and we even have this study of mostly self-reported sort of stories of people who are basically saying that they adopted this diet of and eating so many animal products and they got better. Then it should mean, okay, so maybe we have that model and it can explain something, but there is parts of it missing, and we should basically investigate it further and do some more research on that or studies on that. In that regard.
Well, I think the really interesting thing about carbohydrate restriction and ketogenic diets is that they change a lot of the rules of metabolism, because you're shifting your metabolism entirely from a carbohydrate dependent one to a fat dependent one. Yeah. And so the common knowledge, the bits of common knowledge that may generally apply in the population start to fall apart.
Yeah.
Like the concept that, saturated fat raises LDL. In the general population, all things being equal, you're eating more saturated fat. Yeah, actually, there is an increase in LDL. It's pretty moderate, but there is an increase. You look at people are on low-carb diets, and actually, that's a pretty minor factor as far as I'm aware. I know people eating very high unsaturated fat diets that have extremely high LDLs, 300, right. 400, 500, and people that go carnivore, their LDL drops and it stays below 100 without any pharmacologics. And I don't think that's just genetic. I think that there's more going on. We can get into a little bit of that with respect to the lipid energy model and body adiposity. Yes. But, things like that, or even just basic bits of knowledge. I bet you ask a regular dietitian, if you trade carbs for fat, what happens to, levels of triglyceride in the blood? Probably most would say it goes up.
Absolutely. Yes.
You know that it tends to go down. Again,
it's like I had that in medical school. We had like case, not really case studies, but sort of, always when we cover a certain topic, and we just had, metabolic syndrome, we had a lecture on that. And there was a patient presenting basically in that lecture who had, elevated triglycerides. And of course, the reason for that was, well, like he was eating lots of fatty foods. And then they were showing a picture of
Did they say that?
They said that, and they showed a picture of pommes. I was thinking like, okay, so where exactly is the, it's like, is he really eating only fatty foods? But the explanation was the primary reason for increased triglycerides is, or one of the reasons is it's still sort of part of the narrative that eating fatty foods will probably increase your triglycerides.
Yeah, no,
I found that a little bit frustrating.
It is, but it's not only part of the narrative, but it's part of the narrative that's perpetuated by what is coming to mind, actually, as I'm saying that is, did you ever see the documentary Game Changers?
I've seen so many debunk videos that I can actually somewhat get an idea of what the documentary. I've actually never seen the entire documentary, but I've seen lots of people commenting on that documentary, so I'm pretty familiar with the content of it.
What was hopping to mind is they did a demonstration that animal products increase lipemia, like fat in the blood.
Right.
What they had people do is eat like a beef burrito versus like a avocado burrito, and then test 2 hours later. Which is absurd. I mean, like chylomicrons and postprandial are so different than what you're actually trying to look at in terms of like a metabolic profile on a fasted test. But that's the kind of like confirmation bias that's out there. Anyway, I'm getting on my soapbox now, but I know. I think we would agree that once you understand basic metabolism, you know that elevated triglycerides come primarily from overproduction of VLDL, trafficking triglycerides in the fasted state, not by how much fat you eat. And we see that even in the RCTs. I think a good one was, the Hyde et al. 2019 paper in JCI. They took people with metabolic syndrome, 16 of them. They put them, it was a randomized crossover trial, which means that they went through 3 different diets. Every participant went through 3 different diets, and they only differed in terms of their fat and carbs. So they were trading fat and carb calories. Protein's the same, calories the same. What did they find? That as you traded carb calories for fat calories, progressively the triglycerides in the blood went down, and metabolic syndrome was preferentially reversed based on carbohydrate restriction in a calorie-controlled manner. I mean, and there's
Right.
multiple studies.
There are multiple RCTs on that, and we have enough evidence actually to say that ketogenic diets are able to substantially reduce the triglyceride. So I think there should be we should finally leave that idea of fat in and of itself raising fasting triglycerides. I think
Yeah,
that's
no, I don't
pretty
think anybody seriously in the space would argue that's the case.
no.
But I want to ask you a question.
Right.
Are you doing clinical rotations yet? I'm not sure where you are in Berlin.
Like sort of the system we are in here in Germany, we start with clinical practices basically from the very beginning, or it's supposed to be that way. We obviously had much less things. We had much more online courses
Right.
than we would have usually because of the whole thing going on right now. So
Right.
that was the reason why there wasn't that much clinical sort of how you say that basically. You know what I mean,
Exposure.
right?
Yeah.
Exactly, clinical exposure basically. We didn't see that many patients. It was planned basically that from the very beginning we would see patients and we would be able to practice our skills and communication skills and basically be able to talk to them and see different diseases. But that was part of the case, partly, but not to the extent that it would have been.
The reason I ask is because one of the things that's astonished me, since being in a few clinics, is the degree to which hypertriglyceridemia. Sorry. Let me turn my phone off. I didn't do that before.
No problem.
The degree to which hypertriglyceridemia is just largely ignored, and the focus continues to be just on LDL. I mean, literally,
Yes.
people I'm sitting there with a physician. Patient comes in, HbA1c. This was actually a case. HbA1c of 6.4, triglycerides well over 300.
Right.
LDL was 90. Doctor tells patient, your cholesterol is looking good. That was the extent of the discussion.
Wow.
And I tried to raise the issue. I'm like, shouldn't we talk to her about her triglycerides?
Yes.
And they're like, oh, okay, yeah, I guess her triglycerides are a little high. And the recommendation that was given is well, she's already on the highest dose statin. That was it. And then I'm like, well, what about the HbA1c? She's like, she doesn't have diabetes. So we'll cross that bridge when we have diabetes.
Well,
and I've seen that kind of thing. You know what? I'm not even going to elaborate. I feel like it stands for itself. People can interpret that as they will.
Exactly. I've been thinking about that.
I don't want to criticize the physician. I'm not trying to get into that game. It's just you see that thing again and again, and it's like
it's pretty frustrating. It absolutely is. It's super frustrating because it's what I was also thinking about. It's that black and white. It's also thinking in cutoffs. As you said with the HbA1c, right? She didn't have diabetes, even though we would all agree on the fact that her HbA1c was not optimal. And so, what if that's already a sign, a concern, and we should maybe do something about it? But doctors say, yeah, it actually looks okay, and maybe the triglycerides are a bit high, but we don't know of anything that is able to lower the triglycerides, and actually statins are also not able to do it, but we still think that maybe they are, and so we give her even more statins, but there's nothing we can do basically about it, and I find it pretty frustrating.
It's about it's about several things. One, are there medications to address it? And then two, when you talk about these cutoffs are all arbitrary. Let me just put it out there. I mean, it's very obvious. There's no difference between, or not a real difference between HbA1c of 6.4 and 6.5.
No.
Other than you arbitrarily create the cutoff. You need cutoffs, but one would think that the job of a physician is to look at things holistically, look at combination markers, and kind of see what's going on. In that case, even without seeing the patients, you have hypertriglyceridemia, your HDL is kind of low, and you have high. Your HbA1c is high, and you have high triglycerides. So you can kind of figure out what's probably going on,
right,
and think about what might work. But diet doesn't even enter the conversation. That meeting had absolutely no discussion of diet. And when you actually look at the diet handouts where I'm rotating, it's scary. It's scary. It's the diabetes education, healthy eating like handouts are things like sweet potato pancakes.
Sure.
With all-purpose flour, another type of flour, brown sugar.
Sure.
And it literally says like for diabetes.
I share your feelings in that regard, because I've been in order to get into the fourth semester, I need to complete 3 months of basically of completing a practice in hospitals. So basically, maybe that's what you were talking about with clinical rotations or something. It's not really bound to the things that I'm learning in university. It's like just practice and I'm like being a nurse, sort of, so to speak. And so I've been seeing the same thing with just food being distributed to the patients. And it was, we have lots of diabetics. There were lots of diabetics on the station that was working, and it was cardiac surgery station. So it was lots of diabetics on that station, because basically almost everyone has got some blood sugar control issue, and that's why they had issues with their heart, basically heart health. Mm-hmm. And so it was really frustrating to see the food they were getting, because it was literally white bread with jam, honey, and fruit yogurt, and maybe there was some cheese. But I was thinking like, okay, that's what you want to give to all the diabetics. I
saw a patient, their fasting blood sugar was literally written on a giant whiteboard. It was the center of it. So obviously they're aware. Fasting blood sugar, 217 milligrams per deciliter, which is absurdly high. And he's sitting there with a piece of chocolate cake and half-eaten mashed potatoes. Actually, it was an empty container that had chocolate cake, I can tell, because it said chocolate cake and there was frosting on it. And I'm like, I'm all for patient autonomy, but like, I don't think this patient might not know the difference. Did anybody even have a discussion about him eating chocolate cake with a fasting blood sugar of 217? And it's, I'm going to change the tone here, because I actually am extremely optimistic. I know we're kind of having a vent session back at each other because we're both in this environment that I consider quite toxic for patients. But I'll tell you why I'm really optimistic is because whereas I thought, going into medical school, having my particular background, maybe I was a bit of an extremist, maybe I am, but maybe I'd be like a pariah, that like I wouldn't be able to hold my tongue. I'd talk about these things and, it would kind of tick people off. I get a reputation, nobody would listen. I have not found that to be the case at all. I have found consistently that when I'm talking to the next gen of doctors and even my professors, when you point these things out, there is a consensus that this is screwed up and needs to be changed. And in the next generation, I'm noticing like actual sheer frustration that I can get people. My goal isn't per se to get them frustrated, but I guess maybe in a sense, maybe it is, because maybe we need to be. And so when you point this out to people and you're like, okay, here's the metabolism. Here's what we're doing. Can you explain the disconnects to me? And you ask your peers, and they're like, "Wow, this is screwed up. This is screwed up. Like, why are we doing this?" And so, the reason I'm really optimistic is because I actually think there is a will in the community and in the next generation of physicians to change the paradigm, because what we know is what we're doing is not working. And quite honestly, like that's where we need to start. I honestly don't care if you're like a low-fat vegan or you're hyper carnivore, keto AF. Like, if we can just agree on some of the basics, like refined sugar is not good for you, we really need to start talking about nutrition and metabolic health and looking at the endpoints, in addition to how you get there. And I want to just pause to do an aside on that. Like, the cool thing about metabolic health is it's about the endpoints. Can you get the profile that suggests you are healthy, the combination profile that suggests you're healthy? We're all individuals. And if you can do that in a way that might be a little bit foreign to me, but you're able to achieve that, then that's great for you.
Right.
And the cool thing about this is, I mean, you by understanding, what the endpoints might be, by understanding the levers that you can pull to kind of get there, you can empirically approach each patient case and kind of iterate and move patients where they need to be. via a bunch of different perspectives or a bunch of different approaches. I'm most familiar with keto, but that doesn't mean it's the only way.
Yeah, I agree. I totally share your optimism in that regard, even though I find it, maybe I haven't been talking to a large enough number of medical students to that point, because we don't really have the opportunity to talk too much with each other, because we are almost, all of us are sitting at home and watching online lectures basically. But I must admit that I do find it a little bit difficult to engage in, conversations that basically, sort of foster that skepticism. I feel like skepticism is not something that the medical community particularly likes or enjoys to hear. That's my subjective feeling of what I have encountered basically over the past, I don't know, 1 or 2 years in regards to different topics. But maybe it's the way I approach certain topics that might be the case. Absolutely, I'm open to that possibility. But if it's something, I agree that if we need to start somewhere, then by having conversations and discussions with our peers, because they are still the most open-minded piece of that whole puzzle. Because I feel like if you're already a medical doctor, then it's often the case that you're too busy like treating patients, and you finished like medical school, and you've been taught all these things, and you've not been taught to think outside the box and think if there might be something else going on. And it's mostly like learning certain things. And I don't know what you can tell me what you think on that. If it's do you feel the same about skepticism not being particularly liked in the medical community? Because that's what my feeling was for the past like several years.
It depends on who you're dealing with. When I'm, in the academic medical setting, and I'm mostly circulating through academic medical centers, I actually find that skepticism, particularly on the part of students, is really applauded. But I think it's very important to think about how one projects that skepticism. And I think often proposing it in the question form with quite honestly, like honest deference to people who have a lot more experience than you, it tends to be very productive. I mean, when I'm talking, I always almost pose things in the form of questions. I kind of gauge, are they in the pre-contemplation, contemplation stage with this paradigm, and kind of wade in with, what do you think about this, or show a particular piece of data and like, how would you interpret this? And let the motivation and the curiosity come from within the person, be that the medical student, be that the professor. It's kind of like, I don't know if you guys have done any motivational interviewing. It's a technique that I'm only just becoming familiar with. But it has to do with, speaking with, or it's supposed to be speaking with patients, and how to, promote behavior change in a manner that'll actually last. So people often have the picture of the physician-patient interaction is kind of paternalistic, and that there's a deficit on the side of the patient, and the physician is going to like tell them what to do. Well, we know that doesn't work. Eat less, move more, like if you're just general advice, or even just go on this diet. The patient, it's not going to stick. The motivation needs to come within.
Right.
And so how do you do that? It's just about, asking the right questions and, drawing out the tension. So, for example, for behavior change, like if somebody's not ready to change, there's no point even going down that road. But, make it clear. It's like, okay, so you want this, maybe you want to lose weight, but these are the obstacles in your way. Can you tell me, what have you tried in the past? Why hasn't it worked? How motivated are you to start up again? Imagine what obstacles come in front of you and how you might deal with those, and kind of just keep on plugging away until you kind of you break through a little bit, and you see that kind of aha moment go on, either be it with the patient, or be it with the professor, or be it with a peer. Kind of just asking the, like, imagine yourself in their position and then ask the questions that might just get you or them in that position to think.
Yes.
And kind of just progress that way rather than saying, here are the data. And I know that's so tempting, because after delving into the space and, say your peers are being taught one thing, you're like, this is nonsense. And I have the key piece of data that just completely debunks it. Here it is. Here's the, double blind crossover RCT, whatever.
Right.
And now you have to listen. It's not how it works. Unfortunately, even, academic medicine isn't all logical.
Yes.
There are a lot of heuristics, and it's just the way of the world.
It's absolutely, I think you're right. It's crucial how you approach these things. And I think by asking questions, you will achieve far more than by just, trying to impose a certain opinion on someone. Even though, like, most of the time, I just, because the lectures and all the seminars and everything, because it's all online, I find it very, very difficult to actually getting motivated in engaging in a discussion with the professor or with the peers, because it's like, okay, like I'm watching that lecture, and they don't have endless amounts of time, so I'm just listening to it, and I do not necessarily agree with everything they say, and it's a bit frustrating if they tell me again that you should stay at home and don't get sunlight because it's killing you, and I'd be like, wow, okay, so should I now ask a bunch of questions and throw this whole thing off? And maybe I'll seem like some jerk who is a crazy, I don't know what, and just super skeptical about everything. And it would be much different if it was a personal conversation. I could come up to them and just ask them questions and stuff. And I find it super difficult in that online setting. Maybe that frustrates me even more.
I think that's very valid. I haven't, when I'm listening to lectures online, there's never it's not productive, because you'll only be able to ask a one-sided question, then they get to retort, and then you can't say anything. And so it's hard to see how the conversation is going to get spun. So then I just would, stay quiet and listen. I mean, your objective right now, or at least I'll say my objective, I'll speak for myself, is, do what I can to make change, on the side. But the main objective is to, get an education in medicine, become credentialed, and then you'll have a better platform to make change.
Yes, exactly.
And so it's fun to get engaged in all this now, podcast, Twitter, whatever.
Yes.
I think we both are, but in actuality, this is almost just like, an outlet for some energy that we're really going to unleash, I think, in the coming years. So.
Yeah, I'm trying to use like podcasts as means to reach some of my fellow medical students, because I'm connected to some of them through like Instagram and other social media platforms, and I maybe there's like someone who listens to some of my podcasts and things like, maybe I should also be like looking deeper in some of these things. Maybe there's more to discover, and so that's maybe a way to reach some of the people and make them also just being more interested in the topics we're discussing here.
Yeah, no, I'm very fond of intellectual transparency. And I feel like that's kind of what we're doing. In fact, I'll just tell you, I don't know how you feel about it, but when I look back on some of the things I put out, either in writing or said verbally, and I'm still new in this space, I'm like, oh God, I can't believe I said that. I can't believe I said that. Like, what was I thinking?
Right.
And I think just it's going to be the way of things. I'm going to look back at some of the things I'm saying now in several years and be like, wow, I really wish I didn't say that on the record.
Yes.
But there's something appealing about that, because what we're doing right now, and what everybody's doing all the time, is just kind of processing their thoughts in the current moment. So that's where I am with all this. I'm not per se doing this because I think that this is going to be the pinnacle of my impact. I hope it's not. And I think the same for you, but it's just like, it doesn't hurt. And it's kind of fun because you genuinely engage people, and like, these are the thoughts that are going on in my mind.
Right.
Be you, a professor who's going to be teaching me, be you a layperson that's interested in what medical students are thinking about, be you another medical student thinking about what medical students are thinking about. It's just like, it's helpful to get insight into, how other people are muddling through these questions, because I think it's a more complicated topic than almost anybody really gives it credit for.
Right.
And I'm not just talking about the biology. I'm talking about the sociology, the economics. the cultural aspects of it, they're all intermingled and really difficult to disentangle.
Yes.
So it's just worth
And
mulling over.
I think it's natural. It's absolutely natural that things and the way you look at things, that they change over time. And I think that's also, I find it very interesting actually if I'm listening to certain people, on podcasts, and I hear that the way they talk about things actually changes, then I find it a very good thing. I find it an extremely positive thing because I'm seeing that the person is evolving. That
Yeah.
I find it very frustrating if I hear the same person talking on over the course of several years the same thing over and over again, and nothing really changes. Like the same thing, and this, and I think like, okay, cool, like we got it, but there's no transformation going on, no evolution of thoughts and of you know what I'm saying. So I
Yeah.
think what you just said, and I've been seeing that on myself. Like there are things that maybe not necessarily I put on record, as you said, but that just I've been thinking about, that I thought, wow, like how could I be so stupid to have that I thought that back then several years ago. But I see like, okay, that means that I'm making progress. That's a good thing, and that's why I
Yeah.
should continue doing that
I
because people will
agree, and
actually recognize.
I agree, and I think it's also very compelling. Like, think about when you actually listen. I really listen when somebody says, "I was wrong about X." I'm like, "What were you wrong
Right.
about? And why did your opinion change?" Not when you get on, and have the same pitch over and over again. And it's also like it's unfortunate. I think social media is in part to blame for this phenomenon where it's it's not accepted to put an idea out there and be wrong. But that's what science is. Like the science is about like I'm
Yes,
gonna make a
man.
bold hypothesis. And if it's wrong, I'm like, cool. All right, I
Right.
learned something. But
Exactly.
that's not accepted anymore. And it often gets twisted where when you put a hypothesis out, somebody thinks you're making like you're putting your flagpole in the sand that this is right. Like, no, this is a hypothesis.
You're
I mean,
exploring, right?
that's what we're doing right now with like the lean mass
Right.
hyperresponder stuff, the lipid energy model. I'm like, I am going to give you a solid prediction that you take this person, all things being equal, they're lean, they have high LDL, high HDL, low triglycerides, very
Mm-hmm.
active. I'm predicting that if they decrease their exercise load, their LDL will go down. If they gain fat, they gain body fat, their LDL will go down. Like that you can
Right.
tweak these variables and this will happen. Let's go test it. And guess what? If I'm dead wrong and it's an entirely genetic phenomenon, then okay. I really genuinely don't have a problem with that. I just want the experiment to be done. But right
Exactly.
now, what we're seeing is like even asking the question is considered dangerous, as with Dave's, and I know Dave Feldman, his lean mass hyperresponder study, the prospective trial looking at people with these profiles to say, all right, is there plaque progression? People are saying, like, you shouldn't even ask that question; it's dangerous.
Like why?
Or you're claiming LDL is not problematic. So no, we're not claiming at all. We're claiming that this is a new profile that isn't represented anywhere. I mean, you look in
Mm.
NHANES, we actually did the analysis. Like, how many LMHR are there in NHANES? At least in NHANES 4, with actual like markers for triglycerides, LDL, and HDL. Grand
Mm-hmm.
total of zero, literally zero. And so it's like
Right.
this is evidently a population that's novel. Let's at least study them. And that's all it is. We just want to direct
Yeah.
the
Before
question.
before before
It's a
maybe
question.
go and talk more about the actual like LMHR phenotype and the lipid energy model, which I would absolutely love to do with you in just a second. Just would like to respond to what you just mentioned in terms of the a question being asked, that being a bad thing. I think that's the danger of that I see of you know identifying. It's probably the thing, if you identify too much with a certain like ideology or camp, and that what people tend to do very quickly, like to be like, okay, that sounds compelling, that sounds interesting to me. I'm like now a keto guy, or I am a vegan guy, and so like I'm making claims, and it's like a fight. It's not necessarily a game where you're discovering things. It's not science anymore, where you're exploring, where you're just asking questions, and you're genuinely interested in finding common ground and an answer to these questions, and just to continue learning. It's more of like it seems to have become more of that mentality of trying to prove a certain point in order to represent your like ideological camp. And I find that very frustrating because that decreases the productivity of the discussion and doesn't make it. And I find it all the time, because it's like, even if you make a claim, you're considered to be a part of something, right? Because if you make a certain claim, you can be easily be considered as a right-wing person, even if you're not. It's just, okay, I'm making a certain claim. I'm not vegan because I made that claim. I'm not keto. I'm not a keto crazy guy because I made that claim. I'm just asking questions.
No, it's absolutely the case. I think a lot of people probably think that they can deduce somebody's like political affiliations based on like the picture of the meal they just ate.
Right.
Which is really absurd when you think about it. But we all
Right.
make those kind of judgments, and the fact of the matter is, we all incentivize it for each other. Like, you literally post a picture to Twitter of you eating 12 eggs, it will get hundreds of likes easily. Whereas if I put out like a 12-part thread on a new paper from Cell Metabolism, it'll get like 2 retweets and 3 likes. We're incentivizing these extreme, just very simple messages on multiple levels, to the point that we're incentivizing, in-group, out-group bias, and quite honestly, mean behavior. Like, you'll get a lot of likes if you take, well, this happened to me. I'll just give an example. Like, a medical doctor took a picture of me, photoshopped my head onto Drake's body with my thumbs up saying like 500 LDL, A-OK, which completely oversimplifies my perspective.
Right.
And it misrepresents it. But like, that's what he's incentivized to do. And, even somebody with an MD is not immune to, positive public support by your friends and social media friends. You get 600 likes for that picture, you're going to do it again.
Sure.
And so, I mean, it's something that in an ideological, a great world, we would all be, keenly aware of that and compensate for our behavior. But on the population level, that's just not going to happen. So you can only be responsible for what you say and do, and just accept that people are going to, label you, and it's kind of the price you pay getting into social media.
Yeah, like hopefully it will maybe start, moving a bit in the right direction, maybe by having actual conversations with people. Just, I think that's why I love podcasts so much, because you always you get that one Twitter post, and you base everything you seem to know about that person on that one Twitter or some tweets. And if you actually listen to what the person says and you hear them talk for several hours on different podcasts, you actually get a way better idea on what the person is actually saying. If the person gets the opportunity to lay out his or her objections and opinions on a certain topic.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So should we talk about the lipid energy model after having rambled about some issues in society and medical school?
As you know, I have no script. I'm happy to talk about anything.
Yeah. Sure. Like I just had some ideas of what we could talk about today, but it was a fascinating thing that we just discussed, and I haven't had that discussion yet with people on the podcast, and maybe so thank you for actually talking to me about that. That was pretty interesting. But making now a segue, okay? So shifting gears to the lipid energy model. You've mentioned some of the things and the LMHR thingy. Just, we don't need to expand that too much, because that's pretty, we could talk about that forever. But just for people to get an idea of what is that lipid energy model and what is a lean mass hyperresponder, if you could try to condense it like in a short segment,
Sure.
How would you describe that to maybe not necessarily a layman's person, but to someone who is not familiar with that? With the work
we'll start with the broader view, but I think to introduce the lipid energy model, one first needs to discuss the lean mass hyperresponder phenotype. And I just want to preface a lot of this by saying, the progenitor of these ideas was originally a friend of mine, Dave Feldman, who's a software engineer, has become, I think, quite well respected in this space. by a lot of luminaries and has become my close partner in moving forward some of these experiments, let's call them. But the lean mass hyperresponder phenotype is a metabolic profile of some people on low carb diets that is typified by very high HDL, very high LDL, and low triglycerides. So LMHR, lean mass hyperresponder, is defined purely by those three things: high LDL, high HDL, and low triglycerides. The particular cutoffs in milligrams per deciliter are levels of LDL above 200, levels of HDL above 80, and triglycerides below 70. A couple things I want to point out about that profile. First is that the HDL and triglyceride components, the very high HDL and the very low triglycerides, is a profile that is exactly opposite that of something called atherogenic dyslipidemia. So right now, the most common, at least in the United States, high-risk profile for someone who's at risk for cardiovascular disease is this high triglyceride, low HDL profile. Generally, the LDL isn't that high because we have a lot of pharmacotherapy to lower the LDL, yet you might still have atherogenic dyslipidemia. It was referred to in a recent Nature article by Peter Libby at Harvard as the changing landscape of atherosclerosis. And now we have a lot of people with pretty low normal LDL, but really screwed up metabolisms. These are part of the markers of metabolic syndrome. So again, the high triglycerides and the low HDLs, atherogenic dyslipidemia, and what we're seeing in this high LDL lean mass hyperresponder phenotype is completely the opposite profile with HDL and the triglycerides. So very high HDL, low triglycerides, opposite that of atherogenic dyslipidemia, and then again the high LDL. The other thing I want to point out about this lean mass hyperresponders profile is actually leanness is not in the definition. And I want to emphasize that leanness is not in the definition. The name lean mass hyperresponder derived from the fact that our friend Dave Feldman, was observing just empirically in the world around him, the minority of people who go on low carb diets, and again, this is a minority, who are seeing this profile, they're almost always very lean and athletic. You don't see someone who's like a BMI of 35 and over fat get high LDL on low carb diets. You just don't, which is kind of weird when you think about it, because a superficial or simplistic view would be like, okay, wouldn't the unhealthy people, the obese, metabolically deranged people, or people with obesity, I think it's important how we use these terms, people with obesity,
right?
You'd think they would have the quote unhealthy response, which would be the high LDL, right? So why is it that it's the metabolically healthy lean people that are having this response? At least that was kind of the empiric observation. What we did recently is actually did a study on this profile where we took survey data from a bunch of people who had been low carb for quite a while, had reported multiple lipid tests of triglycerides, HDL, and LDL from before they were low carb, after they were low carb. They were statin naive. They were eating less than 130 grams of carbs per day. And then we did this, what's called hypothesis naive exploratory analysis, just kind of saying, if we look at all the variables that might associate with LDL change, what are the strongest correlates of LDL change? And what we did end up finding in this study was there is a strong inverse correlation between BMI and LDL change, and a strong inverse correlation between the triglyceride to HDL ratio and LDL change, including levels before the diet. So if you have, you're metabolically healthy before you go low carb, you're more likely to have this LDL change. So it was confirming what we were seeing, which is, again, the punchline. It's lean, metabolically healthy people who are having this big jump in LDL. And without going too much more into the paper and the nitty-gritty of it, the lipid energy model that you were talking about is an explanation for this phenomenon. An answer
let me interject for a second, because I just want to add that, not add, but actually just comment on that, because I find it extremely interesting. The thing you said about we would actually think that this quote unquote unhealthy response with the LDL would actually happen with more unhealthy or like obese, whatever you want to call them, people, and that basically what's also at least I feel like that is the case in in what is being taught in medical school, that, you know, obesity, like if people are overweight, that can increase their cholesterol, and that's like super unhealthy and stuff. And so I've been like, okay, that's so interesting that they say that obesity, if people are overweight, that increases their cholesterol, and here like we see the exact opposite, and that's where the medical community definitely needs to stop being ignorant about it and think, okay, so how can we explain that? We have like that model, and maybe that model might explain how obesity increases cholesterol, but it will never be able to explain how in someone who's lean and adopts a ketogenic diet, and maybe that's something that was never part of that model. We need either a new model, or we need to basically modify that model a little bit. And so that's where basically the lipid energy model comes into play.
Yeah. Well, I do think that the current understanding and lipid energy model are complementary. I won't per se get into how, but I don't think it per se contradicts. I do think it's quite comical, as you say, that you know, obesity raises cholesterol, and in effect, it does to a extent. But when we're saying it raises it, it's like, okay, your LDL goes from 130 to 160. And what we're saying is, okay, no, like I'm talking like 500. Like a person in the case series associated with a paper, LDL 665.
Right.
665. And then he reintroduces carbs and it drops down by 480. It drops down to 185. Wow. So there's something else going on here. And we're not talking, oh, your high cholesterol is 160. We're talking your high cholesterol is 665.
And actually, Dave has had that one experiment. I think there was the white bread processed meat experiment, where he stopped eating fat basically altogether for a week, or how much that was. And his LDL dropped by, was it 180 points? Something along those lines. So it was an insane 280 points. Okay, so no, like it doesn't really matter actually how many points. It's just the fact that the LDL changed to such an insane, unbelievable extent in such a short period of time, and that's inexplicable to the entire medical community. That would never make any sense.
We should give context to what you're talking about. It was a really, again, one of these things where Dave went out there and he did what a scientist should do. He put his hypothesis out there. He made the prediction before he did the experiment. He said, all right, I'm going to switch my diet to one that is, you know, more carbohydrate centric, eating Wonder Bread. And it was like, I think, processed turkey and ham.
Right.
I think it was mostly, he said ham, but then I saw the picture and it was turkey. But anyway, he was eating, you know, and he had pictures of all his meals, white bread and processed meat. He chose this diet because no one would think that this is a healthy diet. No, like this is evidently an unhealthy diet. So what happened to his LDL? It dropped from 283 to, or something like that. It was 280 something or 290 something to the lowest it had ever been at 83. I don't remember the exact numbers, but it was close to 300, dropping to like its lowest ever. As he shifted his metabolism from, you know, fat-based to lipid-based. Again, this is something particular to people who are lean. We can talk about that. But I think it does make the point quite interestingly that there's something else going on here, because he did something unhealthy and got what most physicians would suggest is a, quote, healthy response. And the scary thing about this, and I actually mean this scary clinically because it's not a good thing. You've heard of white coat adherence, maybe? It's the phenomenon that patients tend to be more adherent, compliant with a particular regime prescribed by the doctor in the time period around a medical appointment. Because then the labs will come back a little bit nicer. The doctor will be happy with them. It's quite a common phenomenon. You can Google white coat adherence. Well, now I know a lot of people, at least anecdotally, engaging in what's called white bread adherence based on that protocol, where it's like, all right, my doctor, and I'm not saying this is a good thing. I'm saying this is what's happening. And it's actually probably very problematic, where it's like, all right, my doctor wants me to take this statin, wants me to lower my cholesterol. I'm not concerned about it. I'm not saying they shouldn't be. I'm just saying this is what's happening. And they'll just add back carbs, not per se white bread. It can be whole food carbs, like a sweet potato or something, particularly to drop their LDL, get a good number, and either get their doctor to be happy with them or just get insurance coverage. Because if you're running around with LDLs of like above 500,
exactly,
you know, it can be problematic for like even insurance coverage. And if you can be like, all right, I'll eat a potato a day for a week to drop my LDL to 100, then I can get coverage and I can go back off of it. Like, people are doing that, and it's funny. And
it's being replicated,
scary,
right?
But it's the fact that it's happening is kind of astonishing, and like this is happening under people's noses. And right now, or at least until our paper came out, it was something that people were like, no, this is a joke. You have people on YouTube saying, my LDL's so high, it can't even get any higher with diet. It's like, and I'm not going to name the person who put this video out, but literally, like, I think his LDL was like 180. He's like, I could not believe how high my LDL got. Like, people say if you have LDL this high, it needs to be genetics. It can't even be diet.
Right.
And then we're seeing what we're seeing. I'm like, we've been talking about this on and on for, at least Dave has, for years, and no one's listening. Now people are starting to listen. And it's crazy the people that are coming out of the woodworks saying, oh crap, I've seen this. I've literally had now more than one of my attendings within a very prominent medical system, let's just say, come out and not only say, I either have patients with this profile, but I myself am a lean mass hyperresponder. Here are my lipids. I am a lean mass hyperresponder. Me, this, big shot MD PhD at this big shot hospital. It's not something that gets talked about, but it's like, it's there. So now, the purpose of this first study was just to get the ball rolling, to speak about this is a fascinating phenomenon. Like I said earlier, you try to look in NHANES, there are no lean mass hyperresponders, at least not in NHANES 4. And yet we can, have this cohort with 100, and we can verify some of their lipids, at least in the case series, and I can definitely verify my own lipids. Like, it's absolutely a thing. And it's really interesting, the fact that people in this community can report doing quite a lot to manipulate their LDL like, they have a joystick. Oh, I'm going to have some carbs, drop my LDL. Dave and I have both gained weight to drop our LDLs just for the sake of it. There's a lot of things you can do that are outside the standard protocol. And the magnitude of the effect you can have, like people dropping their LDL by 480 with a sweet potato, and yet, you're pushing medications as first line, which actually don't tend to work that well, as far as I'm aware, in this profile from the, they work a little bit, but, they're not going to work like that sweet potato. And so what's going on? Let's talk about it. And the lipid energy model is trying to start to explain what's going on. And the pitch of it is basically, when you shift from a carbohydrate-centric metabolism to a fat-based metabolism, if you're lean, you have an upregulation in the global trafficking of fat coming from your liver in the form of triglycerides, stored fat, packaged into VLDL particles. These big particles that get shipped out of your liver, and then the triglycerides kind of get sucked out at fat tissue and at, highly oxidative tissue, cardiac tissue, and skeletal muscle tissue. And then what happens is, if there's, an increase in lipolysis, so kind of the cycle is, you have an increase in lipolysis, which, at your fat tissues, you have NEFA, non-esterified fatty acids, kind of dripping into the blood. Those fatty acids are used to fuel tissue. Then there's a lot of them that get taken up by the liver. They get repackaged into triglycerides, put on VLDL, then shipped back out. And then the triglycerides get sucked out of the VLDL to replenish the fat, affect the muscle, or feed the muscle tissue. And what you're left with is the VLDL decay product, which is the LDL, which has a longer half-life than the VLDL, so you see your LDL go up. And then the HDL component comes in the remodeling process. So in the process of taking this big sphere VLDL particle, sucking up the core of it, the triglycerides, leaving you with an LDL, what happens is when you shrink the VLDL sphere, the surface area needs to change, right? You need to shed surface components, and a lot of those surface components, the phospholipids, the free cholesterol, they're accepted by HDL.
Right.
The HDL particles act as the acceptor. And so then you can see how you'd end up with this triad of high HDL and high LDL and low triglycerides, because as you have more VLDL turnover, you're going to get the triglycerides sucked out, those levels drop. You're left with the LDL from the decay product of the VLDL, and in the shedding of the surface components of the VLDL, you have the HDL, which is kind of picking up the particles, and then returning the free cholesterol to the liver to be used to make bile acids to digest more fat, and so on and so forth. That's the 50,000-foot view of the model, which, if I've done my job, should raise more questions than per se it answers. So what questions do you have when I present that model for why lean people specifically would have this response?
Well, that would be maybe one question, basically. So what is it about lean people that make them particularly more likely to have that response. Before we talk about that, maybe just to make sure that I got everything right. So we basically have more fat trafficking, and that means that we get more VLDL shipped out, basically, and so they end up as LDLs. Is that what happens?
The VLDLs will end up as LDLs, yes.
They end up as LDLs, and so that's why we end up with an increased level of LDL. And by that shrinkage, some of the components of the VLDLs being shipped up by the liver, basically, they, as you say, they being transformed into an HDL, and so that's where we end up with a higher number of HDL.
Not even just per se, not transformed, but sopped up.
Sopped up, okay.
So
right.
What's specifically happening is there's this protein, lipoprotein lipase, LPL, that's very central to the model. It's the thing that's doing the VLDL turnover. It's the thing sucking the triglycerides out, right? And having the VLDL shrink to the LDL. And then the surface components are shed. And then the HDL particles, they actually start off as very small and cholesterol poor, like HDL3 type particle. And what they'll do is they'll grow. So this reciprocal relationship where the VLDL, or let's say the ApoB is the lipoprotein, ApoB on the VLDL. The ApoB particle, VLDL, shrinks to the LDL. And in reciprocation, the ApoA1 particle, in this case, the HDL, will grow. So there's, this donor-acceptor relationship between the ApoB particle, the VLDL, shrinking to the LDL, and the HDL growing. In fact, the larger HDL that is produced as a result of this process has been termed metabolic HDL, in part because it results from this LPL-mediated turnover of the VLDL. And what's really, really beautiful about this, there's multiple elements, but the system is such that even the stomach participates. So we're talking about the liver, and we're talking about I should say the intestines participate. The liver and the muscles, we're kind of isolating those two variables, but it really is a systemic process where, okay, so what happens when you eat fat? Well, when you eat fat and this, you get chylomicrons produced. They're what traffic fat originally in the postprandial state after you eat.
Sure.
Well, where do a lot of the ApoA1s that are used to produce HDL come from? The small intestine. In fact, chylomicrons have a very similar apolipoprotein profile to HDL. So what happens is a similar process postprandially where the chylomicrons get shipped around. You end up getting chylomicron remnants, which are kind of analogous to the LDL. They get taken back up by the liver. But in the remodeling of the chylomicrons are giving the ApoA1 to make HDL, to grow HDL, to even generate HDL de novo. So again, another way by which the small intestine couples with this process to increase the acceptor pool for when you're driving your metabolism based on fat. And then the HDL will return the cholesterol back to the small intestine to be made into bile acids so you can digest more fat. Then you can get more ApoA1 via chylomicron. Like, it's just, when you think about how all these things puzzle together, it's really quite beautiful. And I know this is probably very confusing for people who haven't seen the diagrams that I now have in my head because I've been working on making them. But with all that said, the key question that would come to most intellectuals' minds now is, well, why lean people?
Exactly.
Because
that's what someone might ask now.
Metabolism is fat-based. This should be just happening no matter what your body adiposity is. Because for sure, I mean, even lean people have enough, like, let's say, local fat tissue to fuel activity. Like, it's not a matter of, oh, there isn't enough fat and you're this muscle to give fuel, so therefore I need the VLDL. That's not how it works. Right. Super lean people still have enough fat.
Right. It
has to do, I think, more with the hormonal milieu and the factors that are regulating this protein that does the turnover, the lipoprotein lipase. So I can give you kind of a couple of examples. And again, this is me not telling you here's the answer. Right. This is me saying literally all we've done is made the observation of the phenotype. Here are some things that could explain the answer, and this is going to be on my wish list of future experiments. But one thing to focus on is something like leptin. So, the hormone leptin, it's an adipokine, which means it's a hormone that comes out of fat. And there are some studies showing that hypoleptinemia, low leptin, occurs at least during fasting, at the early phase of a fast. That leptin drops really fast, not because you're burning fat, but as a metabolic response, as a hormonal cue. So say in the first 24 hours of fasting, your leptin might drop by 50%. At least it does
Right.
in mice. And what's
Well,
been shown
because
is
leptin suppresses satiety and suppresses
yes,
hunger, basically, increases satiety. So if you're fasting, obviously the signal is going to be turned down. So that makes
yeah,
sense.
well, it's that's
And
true,
yeah,
but when you think about things that stimulate and inhibit satiety, there tends to be you think about the long-term signaling molecules and the
right.
short-term signaling molecules.
And
So
leptin
something
is one
like
of the
ghrelin.
long-term signaling molecules.
Ghrelin is something I think it's made by the fundus of the stomach, and I could be wrong on that, but
Mm.
it's short term where it's like okay, between
Right.
meals, ghrelin's going to rise, it's going to make you hungry. People think more of leptin as
It's a long-term
you know
molecule, a
as a
signaling
long
molecule.
term. So the more fat you have, the higher your leptin.
Right.
Or you should be less hungry until you reach a normal body weight.
It's like regulating the set point body weight, right?
Yeah, yeah. And
In
so
some sense.
there's a couple issues with that. First of all, obviously it's not that simple. We used
Yes,
to think
sure.
it was, but obviously, if that were the case, then you just get fat, your leptin would come up, you'd be not hungry, and it will go back down. Actually, what we find is there's a phenomenon called leptin resistance,
Exactly.
where it kind of goes hand in hand with insulin resistance, but you can have very high leptin, and it's not sending the signal.
Mm-hmm.
And it tends to, again, like I said, go hand in hand with insulin resistance, which would be the same thing: high insulin, hyperinsulinemia, and you're not getting the signal. So,
Mm-hmm.
that can impart. Well, now I'm getting off topic, but with respect to the short-term mechanisms of action of leptin, it has short-term effects too. And what we see is that with fasting and probably carbohydrate restriction too, in lean mass hyperresponders, is
Mm-hmm.
leptin will drop like a rock.
Yeah.
Not because you're burning body fat. I mean, you are, but actually more as a signal to allow you to burn body fat. So what we find is maybe you need the combined hormonal metabolic, like maybe low insulin and low leptin are simultaneously necessary to really get an upregulation in non-esterified or lipolysis of the fat tissue to get the NEFA dumped into the bloodstream so that you can initially start this cycle. Because what we actually find, and this is kind of paradoxical, or one would think paradoxical, it's lean people, and this has been documented, that have the big increase in fatty acids in the blood, glycerol in the blood, markers of shifting to a fat-based metabolism.
Mm-hmm.
When you're carbohydrate restricting or fasting, and it's paradoxical. I say that because it's in a mixed diet state. It's the people with obesity and diabetes who are metabolically unhealthy that tend to have higher fatty acid levels. But
Right.
what we would see in somebody that's lean and fasting is this big jump in
Mm-hmm.
turnover of fat tissue, maybe less so in people that are less metabolically healthy. So
Mm-hmm.
one possibility, and this is supported by some human and some animal model data, is that you need the combination of the low leptin and the low insulin to really unleash this fat burning potential. And of course, if you're obese, your leptin is going to be high, so you won't have that second necessary factor to start the cycle. And I will actually just say that something pretty cool about the leptin phenomenon is that it's triggered by I think it's the rate of glycogenolysis at the liver. So glycogenolysis is the breakdown of glycogen. Glycogen,
Mm-hmm.
lysis. Lysis is breakdown.
Right.
And as your glycogen is broken down and you start to get glycogen depleted, that rate's going to obviously slow because you don't have as much
Mm-hmm.
glycogen to be broken down. And so what the mouse data show is that, actually, the liver is serving as kind of a hub, a regulatory hub for this drop in leptin. Because if you just take mice and you inhibit glycogenolysis by just giving a glycogen phosphorylase inhibitor, so you can do it
Mm-hmm.
with like a drug, then you can recapitulate this phenomenon. And you can also do the same thing or block the the metabolic state that we'd expect by just adding back leptin. So there might be a way in which glycogen stores couple with leptin so that when you're fasted and you're lean, the glycogen stores drop below a certain level, the leptin drops, and you don't actually have high background leptin because you're not obese. And then you get a hormonal state that will facilitate, fatty acid turnover. So that's one
Right.
example. Other examples have to do with proteins called ANGPTLs, which also correlate with body adiposity. So something like ANGPTL8, this is a protein that inhibits lipoprotein lipase. And if you're heavier or you have more body adiposity, that level will be different, right?
Mm-hmm.
Higher in this case. So then it will end up inhibiting lipoprotein lipase, and you won't have this increased turnover. So there's a lot to how body fat regulates hormones, be it ANGPTLs,
Right.
be it leptin, that could explain why only lean people are having this phenomenon. Quite honestly, I don't think we know exactly the formula, the hormonal formula to explain this. But the phenomenon is robust. And the fact that it's biologically plausible, there are a lot of biologically plausible mechanisms, means that, what the best line of any paper is, the final line, further study is needed. It's exactly what we're saying. So it's like, exactly. I can come up with these ideas, I can spew them to you, and somebody on Twitter can listen to this, not like me, and fairly criticize me for just completely speculating. But that's what I'm doing, and that's why I want to do the next study.
Yeah, and that's I think that's what we all appreciate you for actually putting forward these ideas, and because we're like all looking for legitimate answers to that. And if the first step is maybe what people confuse with that where they might think that you're trying to put forward a clear answer is maybe because it sounds plausible and because it sounds like a plausible mechanism. This does not necessarily mean that that is exactly what is happening. It's basically, okay, here we go. That's what happens in the body that might be able to explain the phenotype. We need to test if that's actually the case.
Not only that, but to what degree is it the case?
Right.
I would actually and I'd be pretty confident that hypoleptinemia has something to do with it.
Right.
But is it 20% of the effect? Is it 80% of the effect?
Exactly.
So I bet you I bet you I could make pretty strong predictions about ANGPTLs, about leptin, and in the lipid energy model paper, I'm going to do that. We'll put the predictions out there. But even if we're dead right on that, it does not mean it's every piece of the puzzle. And that's what's so exciting. When you have a new phenomenon like this, is this is literally only the beginning. Dominoes 1 and 2, think about all the mysteries, because this is the exception to the rule. So let's recreate some rules.
Right, and let us talk real quick about so you've mentioned the study that Dave Feldman is currently running, and so maybe just so that people get an idea of what we're talking about and how that might help us further determine of whether that specific triad and that specific phenotype actually poses a higher risk. Because that's what essentially the medical community is not concerned with, right? They think, okay, so you can not have such a high, astronomically high LDL level and still be reasonably healthy, or not being of an increased risk of heart disease.
Right. So in terms of the prongs of the projects we're engaging in, there was the observation that we made in the LMHR paper. We're working on the model paper. There's some case series going on. But then kind of the crowning jewel at the time being is the LMHR study that's going on out of the Lundquist Institute at UCLA. So this is something that Dave fundraised well over $250,000 for, and recruited some really stellar people, the PI of which, the principal investigator, is this guy, Matt Budoff, who is a luminary and highly respected in the field of lipidology. Something like 1,200 papers to his name. Everybody knows him in the field. And so he's signed on because he thinks this interesting. This is interesting. And what they're doing basically is taking people who fulfill a slightly looser subset of criteria for the LMHR phenomenon. It's like LDL above 190, I think, triglycerides below 80, HDL above 70, something like that.
Right.
It's a little bit looser. And then tracking them over the course of a year by coronary CT angiogram, CCTA, to look for evidence of plaque accumulation. And for those people that know a little bit about cardiac imaging or have gotten something like a CAC, CIMT, I do want to highlight that this is a different scan. This is a scan that will look at not only at calcified mature plaque, but soft plaque as well. And that the senior author, who is one of the pioneers in cardiac imaging, is pretty confident that 1 year is a long enough time frame to kind of see whether or not people are having meaningful progression.
Exactly.
With these very, very high LDLs. And just because the cutoff's 190 doesn't mean we don't have some, or they don't have some people with very high levels, again, like 400, 500, 600. And so the question is, do these people have progression? This is jumping the gun a little bit on the model, but all these things can happen simultaneously, and this will help direct the clinical management of lean mass hyperresponders. And I say that because the fact of the matter is, for some people, the answer is kind of obvious or easy. Like the people in our case series that we had for the LMHR paper came in, LDL's very high. One guy had an LDL, like I said, 665. Given where the data are at the point in time, the conservative thing to do is lower your LDL. We don't know, given this profile, that it's going to be harmful, but all the data at this point in time, one would say the preponderance of evidence would suggest, yeah, this is very risky.
Mm.
And so the solution was easy, at least in our case series. It's like, oh, just change the way your metabolism is working a little bit. So add back some carbs. So rather than going on medication, a person adds back a sweet potato and their LDL drops to a reasonable level. For those people, that's an option. The thing is, it's not so easy for every patient. I have people telling us again and again, like, oh, well, if you can be lean and have high HDL and low triglycerides and lower your LDL, like, why wouldn't you just do that? Plus, you get to eat sweet potatoes. Yeah, for some people, that's true. But there's a huge portion of the low-carb community that isn't doing this for diabetes or weight loss. They're using it for neurological conditions, for like, terrible inflammatory or autoimmune diseases like me. And for those people, they're caught in a pickle because some of them are really, really worried about their high LDL. At the same time, they know they reintroduce carbs, they go out of ketosis. They can be really sick. They can have lupus flares. They can have multiple seizures. There are actually a good number of people that we know who it's like, the doctor's like, okay, their LDL is high. Now we know we can call them a lean mass hyperresponder. This little kid. So we need to reintroduce some carbohydrates or give them a medication. And yes, that's going to increase their seizures in a dose-dependent manner, but we're going to have to kind of, take that hit. And so people are literally changing their diet, experiencing more daily seizures because they don't know if this is, or to what degree, let's just say, this is a risk profile, a high risk profile. So, patients like that deserve an answer just to have more clear data upon which to base their decision. And now, is it possible that there's going to be at least a subset that don't have any progression, and it's actually not as high risk a profile as most people think? Maybe, and that would be super valuable. But it would be also super valuable to confirm in this very peculiar form of high LDL that there is, say, progression. Even that would provide, I guess you could say, peace of mind or a clarity in decision making for this community. And right now, I would say, lean mass hyperresponders are a phenomenal opportunity to study, not just because these patients need it. So that's the kind of like clinical aspect, the urgent clinical aspect to direct this clinical care, but also just to give probably the most solid test to the standing lipid hard hypothesis, which holds that high LDL drives atherosclerosis. It's just assumed that by bulk flow, high ApoB can just drive heart disease.
I would absolutely love to talk about the lipid hypothesis a bit more. Just one thing I wanted to add on the study, because you've been mentioning that we can see that there's no plaque progression, or there is plaque progression. I think what is also a thing that you need to keep in mind is basically that we need to compare the amount, if the amount of plaque progression that we will see is actually the amount that we expect or not expect, because we can see some small amount of plaque progression, and that might be in the ballpark of normal plaque progression that we would expect in a regular person. And then we basically need to compare if on that high level of LDL, we would actually expect that insane big amount of plaque progression, but it's actually much less than we actually thought. So that would also give us a hint on how much we actually need to modify the diet for the people who are on this diet, and how much they actually need to go off of that diet or not go off that diet for the sake of lowering LDL. So maybe if we see, okay, that risk is much lower, maybe there's an increased risk, fair enough, but maybe it's lower than we thought. And so it will be more valuable for those people who are on that diet for certain medical conditions to stay on that diet and take that maybe slightly higher risk, but then their overall quality of life will be way better because they can manage their condition.
I would say you're hitting at some important nuances in the study. One is, comparison to a control group. And I would say that's a limit of the study, but a strength of the phenomenon. And what I mean by that is, no, there's no control group. In fact, you can't have a control group.
Sure.
Because as far as we know, the phenomenon is so reproducible that you couldn't have people being on the same form of diet who have like low LDL. It's just
Right.
that control group hasn't been produced. That said, there isn't actually generally that great background data. We don't have a lot of CCTA data, you know, in general for progression in people who are otherwise healthy. So there's a paucity of evidence, and that's a limitation. It's going to make it more difficult to interpret the study findings. It doesn't mean that they're useless because you still have the absolute change, and the absolute change is in and of itself useful. But I would actually advocate that we need to do more functional testing because no matter what the data say,
Right.
on the population level, there's going to be an error. There's going to be a standard deviation.
Yeah,
So every
sure.
patient is going to be different. It's not going to tell us what to do in any individual patient case.
Absolutely.
So or how to interpret it. Like if you'd have, a scan of somebody who's had LDL of 600 for multiple years, and they have a perfectly clean scan at baseline, or at their first scan after multiple years, but they're a young person. How do you interpret that? Because we don't have much data on young people.
Exactly.
You actually can't. The whole point of doing these kind of studies is to kind of like push towards that direction of getting harder core functional evidence. And again, in this population, it becomes really difficult because it's really hard. Actually, it's basically impossible to generate a good comparison group. And there just aren't that much CCTA data. So we're going to have absolute changes, and it's going to be up to the, experts to, and when I say experts, I mean people who have actually done the publications on cardiac imaging to interpret this for themselves in terms of what the absolute number come out to be. And if it's 0 and there's no progression, wow. And if it's really, amazingly profound, large progression, then okay, wow, that's probably going to be somewhere in the middle. And not only that, it's probably going to be, distributed over the spectrum of the population. So we might get a multimodal distribution where people who are lean mass hyperresponders now, but have a history of diabetes and obesity and pre-damaged endothelium, they might be at really high risk. For them, this might be a really high risk profile. For other people who, became lean mass hyperresponders without any pre-existing damage, maybe they're fine. And it just remains to be seen.
Yeah, exactly. And I think we're all pretty excited for the study to basically come out when the results are in. And I think we're all very excited on what the results are going to be. But the one interesting thing that also Dave Feldman has been talking about is basically how people who were skeptical of the LMHR phenotype, of the idea that they might actually not necessarily be of higher risk of developing atherosclerosis. That's paraphrasing. I try to paraphrase what Dave Feldman was saying, that they're not sort of moving back from that position, saying that okay, maybe they are at higher risk, but maybe not as much as we thought they would. Maybe they'll be at a slightly higher risk, but because they are healthy and like fit and their diet is somewhat healthy, maybe they're not going to be of that much of an increased risk as we thought in the beginning. So that's an interesting phenomenon, I think.
There's definitely goalpost moving as we get closer and closer to it, because I don't think people want to be wrong. And it is quite interesting to kind of take a backseat and just watch the criticisms roll forward and evaluate them. Everybody can evaluate them for themselves, but sometimes they're just like, they're silly or they get to the point of what we're trying to do. So, for example, a silly criticism that I've heard recently is, people are like, wait, after our paper came out, Dave just made up the LMHR criteria? He just made them up? I'm like, well, and he's like, and we're like, I'm like, that's just basically like what we do for everything. The HbA1c of
exactly
5 that we're talking about, the cutoff.
Yeah, that's what people do, like in medicine, constantly.
It's how science works. You come up with a pattern, you recognize it, then you test the hypothesis. So it's just like, because it was Dave Feldman that came up with it, then it's problematic. But whatever.
Right.
And other things are like, okay, yeah, they might not have that much progression, but it's because of, you could call it healthy user bias, right? They have high LDL, but they exercise and they sleep well and they might eat a healthy diet. They could eat a lot of monounsaturated fat and plants because, that's not exclusive with a lean mass hyperresponder phenotype, whatever. But that's the point. That's what we're trying to say. It's like, is high LDL alone enough to drive it? Because if you have a perfectly healthy person, but their LDL is 400, if they're actually a low risk profile, then they shouldn't be treated. Is that what you're saying? I mean, that's the point. We want to isolate. This is the first time, and this is actually what I was trying to get to say earlier, is I can't think of any other circumstance where we have a human condition of high LDL, isolated high LDL as an isolated risk factor.
Right.
To test the idea that LDL alone is sufficient to drive heart disease. We have mouse models that are genetically modified. We have metabolically unhealthy people and epidemiology like that, or epidemiology based on populations that are metabolically unhealthy. We have, genetic forms of high LDL, which are different because in those forms, I would argue that you're actually breaking lipid metabolism in a sense. If you have an LDL receptor mutation in familial FH, you have a broken feedback loop. That's different than a metabolic response, or I would think it could be different. And when you do the population level data and say, okay, in the Mendelian randomization, even when we're including, polygenic risk, it's just different shades of the same thing. Again, genetic differences of people on mixed diets. It really doesn't, in as clean a way as lean mass hyperresponders, isolate the high ApoB. And so this, I think people who are attached to the lipid heart hypothesis should be like, of course we want this study to be done, because it's a remarkable test of this hypothesis. Right. No one is trying to prove Dave Feldman wrong harder than Dave Feldman.
Exactly. Yes.
Because that's what this study is doing effectively. And again, I think if it comes out that they have profound progression on the order of what we see in FH, I, for one, and I'll speak for Dave because I know he feels the same way, will stand by the data as like, okay, we made a contribution to science and answered this question because I think it contributes something. People might say it contributed nothing in that case, but all I have to say is it's a worthwhile question to ask. Some people think that the study's not worth doing. I think it's absolutely worth doing. And I just want honest data. Either way, I'm like, I've alluded to the fact that I'm a lean mass hyperresponder. Look, I'm gambling with my heart here. I'm not trying to be flippant about this. If there's progression, I want to do something about it. And I've tried to do a lot. But again, I'm one of those people who's in a pickle where it's like, do I want to trade quality of life for, longevity? If this is shortening my life, I actually don't know. It's kind of a black box because of my, genetic profile. Is taking this medication for the rest of my life a good thing for me? You look at the data on that, and it's just like, quite honestly, there are a lot of unknowns, and you just want more precise data to help direct clinical care. That's what this all comes down to. So again, being open-minded about it, all open questions. I think these are questions worth asking.
I think that's an absolutely excellent point, and especially for those people, even for those who are big proponents for the lipid hypothesis, as you elaborated, because if and that's basically the lipid hypothesis. If we summarize it, that LDL alone is basically enough to initiate atherosclerosis in a nutshell. So if we don't go too deep, like I think every big proponent of the lipid hypothesis, of course, that's not the entire lipid hypothesis, but they would be all, I think, comfortable with saying that if they would see someone with a very high LDL, they would think that they are of a very increased risk of heart disease. That the LDL alone is enough as a risk factor, and it's basically the most important risk factor, or at least that's what I perceive of us being taught in medical school. Or I at least being taught in medical school. That go ahead.
For people in academic medicine, if you push them on that question, is LDL the most important risk factor for heart disease? They'd say no. Because if you stop to think about it, everybody kind of knows that. Like the data are pretty clear that it's not the strongest risk factor. But clinically speaking, the mentality about it is look for the LDL, treat the LDL. Yes. That's just been internalized into the clinical ethos. So when you're talking about like maybe non-academic, just most PCPs treating, that's generally where people will go on the population scale. I would agree. I do want to interject one more nuance, though, because I think it's important. Distinguishing between necessary and sufficient.
Sure.
What we're talking about, the way we're phrasing it, is almost like the lipid heart hypothesis is saying that LDL provided every other biological piece that's in a general human, like, okay, you have functional macrophages, XYZ, is in place. That high LDL is alone sufficient. Yes. High LDL is alone a marker to drive atherosclerosis. What we do know and I want to stand by this, is it is necessary. Having high ApoB or having reasonable levels of ApoB is necessary. Like, you do need LDL to get heart disease. And so if your LDL is very, very low, or if you treat it, and reduce it, that can reduce your risk. I'm not saying it can't. I think it would be definitely overstepping the data, or stepping just like into the data to try to make that argument. And I'm not trying to make that argument, nor am I trying to make the argument that we should never lower LDL. But like you said, on an individual patient basis, it's a much more complicated algorithm, because how much are you reducing the risk? When you're giving this medication and changing the ApoB levels, the LDL levels, like what other things are you doing? There's a recent MR study showing that, like, you give a PCSK9 inhibitor, which is the new hot drug that lowers LDL by the most.
Exactly.
And yeah, it lowers LDL, it can lower cardiovascular risk, but guess what? The odds ratio predicted for an on-target PCSK9I for Alzheimer's disease is 2.3, which is high. That means you're going to have that suggests, this is not confirmed, but all things being equal, an increased risk of Alzheimer's disease. Like, do you want to make that trade? Again, that's not confirmed, but it still remains within the realm of possibility, and it hasn't been disconfirmed either. So it's, a more complicated question of just the single variable of lowering LDL. And I think in some patients, it's a very clear-cut case for, I use the statin. I definitely think there's a role for them. But then in other people, like lean mass hyperresponders, it's more complicated.
Yeah, the point,
and
basically,
that's all I want to say. Yeah.
The point that I was trying to make was basically that if those who are on the side of LDL being one of the most important risk factors, not maybe the most important, but being an important enough risk factor sufficient to drive atherosclerosis, whatever, then you would think that even if you have such a low risk population, without that healthy user bias thingy, and you have only the only isolated risk factor, as you described, is the very, very high LDL. You would still think that you would see enough progression to confirm that they are at increased risk of heart disease. If that's not the case, then it would be kind of difficult to make the case of now LDL being one of the most important risk factors, even if it is involved in atherosclerosis. You know what I'm saying?
The clinical mentality around the lipid heart hypothesis, which I think has its merits, is so strong. It almost seems like there shouldn't be an exception. And we know there are exceptions. And so I guess what I would ask is, why not get curious about the exceptions? Investigate the exceptions. Because even if we find, okay, let's say lean mass hyperresponders have no progression whatsoever. 100 lean mass hyperresponders and 0 progression. That's not going to happen, I don't think. But let's just say it happens. It doesn't actually say disprove the lipid heart hypothesis in its general form. It's saying, well, here's a strong exception to a model. So why are they an exception? Let's investigate that. Because in investigating that, you can kind of forward our understanding of lipidology and cardiovascular risk for the entire population, and then figure out how to lower risk in everybody. Because guess what? What we've been doing is not working. Cardiovascular disease is still one of the top killers. Even though we keep on innovating new therapies to drop LDL, this is still killing people. So there's another, there's a clinical exception to the rule, let's get interested about it and study it. So I think this is a super valuable study that everybody should be behind. And I think that's true of just the phenomenon in the model. Like, this should be something like our LMHR paper, which has actually gotten really positive responses. But there was a time when we were really worried that everybody would just attack it because it's such a politicized space. And then we tried to craft it in such a way that it's like, we want to make the point. This is good for everybody. This is amazing for the physicians that are like, okay, I know a low-carb diet could reverse my patient's diabetes and metabolic syndrome, but I'm worried about their LDL jumping. Well, guess what? We're saying, actually, they're at very, very low risk. So this big population, the main population that we're using it for now, obesity, diabetes, you should not be worried. And, as for the source of the worry, the high LDL, well, we're going to investigate that. And also, okay, fine. Maybe your BMI is 35, you're overfat, you go on a low-carb diet, you then end up with a six-pack. Unfortunately, your LDL goes up with your six-pack. Okay, well, actually, we know what you can do now. You just add back some carbs.
Yes.
So it provides a lot of information that I think should peace of mind for a lot of physicians and patients. And then this is just the next step of the puzzle. I just think it's fascinating. I think, like you,
Yes.
it's like we're stepping into this area of clinical medicine. I'm stepping in, from an area of academia, and it's just like I just want to help patients the best I can, and I want to progress medicine the best I can. And I feel like there are deficits and the way society treats chronic disease and the way we understand some of these leading killer diseases that I genuinely want a better understanding.
Yes.
In part because I'm a nerd, but in part because I want to be sitting with a patient, in 10 years and be a lot more confident in my understanding of their disease process and how I can help them. And if that means putting them on a statin, fine. If it means not and kind of going another route, then fine. I really don't care. I just want to know.
No, I'm absolutely on your side here, and that's the reason why why I'm trying to engage in these conversations basically, and also try to research these things, because I'm so frustrated when I get the impression in my online lectures in a medical school that we basically have figured it all out. I'm thinking like, no, we don't. We're clearly not, because people are still getting sick. Like, they're getting sick all the time and they die. And so how can we pretend and say that we have figured it all out? So that's what I think when I look the lectures and think like, you talking about all these things and you don't, you need really to think through all these things, and you need to have an idea of how this works in order to be able to ask these questions. If you just watch these lectures, someone could just think, okay, it sounds plausible. It sounds like we have all the answers. I'm thinking like, it may seem like that, but it actually cannot be the case, because people die and are sick, and there are things to be figured out still, and there are questions that should be asked, and there are things that still don't make sense, because in the end, we're still in the process of building a model in order to be able to explain the observations we're making. And so if there's another observation, like the LMHR phenotype, then okay, we either need to expand the model, to modify the model, we need to come up with a new model, but we somehow need to be able to find things or means to now explain these observations that we're making.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so that has been my kind of frustration, and I feel like we're not going to be able to dive super deep into atherosclerosis. I think that we'll I don't know how much time have we left, Nick? For you?
I probably. Oh wow, we've been going for almost 2 hours.
Right.
I should probably go. I have to move some
Exactly.
stuff.
So I think we'll leave the discussion about pathophysiology of atherosclerosis for another time, because I feel like you're a good one person to chat about this exact topic, and I've been jumping back and forth about this exact thing, because I'm like super interested in the process. As you said, data is one thing, and in the end, we like looking at studies and see what are the results. But I'm kind of super interested in actually figuring out the process. So what's actually going on? So what is the physiology? What's the things that are happening in the process of atherosclerosis exactly? And so and again, it has to be a model where everything fits beautifully, or so that there are not too many things that don't make sense. And that's how I feel what was increasingly happening over the past years that I've been thinking about it. There were just some of these pieces that didn't fit into the existing model. I'm thinking like, okay, so what am I to do with that?
Yeah. Well, the great thing about science is there's always a rabbit hole to go down.
Absolutely.
There's always going to be a gap in the model.
And it's so crazy. Like, the rabbit hole is endless.
Yeah, that's why I love biology.
Right. It's super fascinating.
Well, thanks for having me on. It was
Nick, it was fascinating. It was really cool. Please tell people where they can maybe learn more about you and find out more about your work. And I think everyone who is still with us at that point will want to learn more about what Nick is doing. And so tell us where they can find you.
Thanks. You can follow me at Nick Norwitz on Twitter. Other than that, like I said earlier, keeping a relatively low profile to maybe what I will in several years, just because, like you, I'm focused on my education. And yeah, if you want to follow me at Nick Norwitz, and then maybe download our recent paper, take a read for yourself, share it around, that would be greatly appreciated, because we just want to start a conversation about this. And so hopefully people will be interested in this line of research and continue to, keep up to date as these things are coming out, because, in all my plentiful free time, this is what I'm working on, and I find it very fun.
What about your YouTube channel? I remember you had some interesting educational sort of videos there.
Yeah, since starting school, I haven't been putting that much on, but I do have a
Right.
YouTube channel. You can just look up my name, where I sometimes nerd out about papers that come up, especially if people ask me to, or, if I give a lecture on the topic. So I'm going to give a lecture on our paper for a group, and I'll post a version of that to YouTube. So every now and then something will come up. I'll usually post it on Twitter as well, via YouTube. But yeah, you can check on my channel as well. And yeah, and if you like Mediterranean cooking, Mediterranean keto, I do have a Mediterranean keto cookbook, which I did not even because, okay, first of all, I do like the food. Not even because I'm not like a big plant-based person by any means, but I feel like there's so much dogma around or misperception around what keto looks like. I feel like for getting people into it, kind of dipping their toe in the water, it's very helpful to have a picture of salmon and avocado with nuts and stuff. I'm like, yeah, you can do it this way if you want. You can do whatever way you want. I don't really care. Whatever works for you. But I had fun writing that with some people. So anyway, well, have a great afternoon. Evening.
Thank you so much. That was very interesting. I've learned a lot. I love exactly like these kinds of conversations where you do not realize that 2 hours have actually passed after these 2 hours have passed. So I find that increasingly interesting to have these conversations, because it's sort of, you're at the edge of, you're comfortable with talking to someone, and someone have somehow see eye to eye on the topics you talk about, but you still enter that space of unknown where you learn new things, and where it's like things seem to shake a bit, and it's like it might be dangerous because you feel uncomfortable in some sense, because it's like new territory. And so I find that very, very exciting.
If only med school lectures could pass so fast.
Agree. It might be torturous.
All right. Well, have a good one.
So yeah, thanks a lot, and talk to you later.
Bye.